It's the largest disruption of global education systems in history. When the pandemic first hit, around 1.5 billion students around the world were sent home as schools closed their doors. Some have since reopened, but class isn't in session for half of the world's school children. The lucky ones were able to pursue their studies online. But for many, even in developed countries, that's not an option. The world was already struggling to come to grips with educational inequality. Now, the United Nations warns the COVID crisis is making it worse, disproportionately affecting the most vulnerable and threatening to wipe out decades of progress for this generation and possibly beyond. At the height of the pandemic, schools in some 190 countries closed their doors. Many have since reopened, but the experience of lockdown heightened major inequalities in education. And even richer countries like Germany have struggled with the challenges of going digital.
Pencils are sharpened, books are out. German students are back in the classrooms. But it seems not much of the digital learning put in place during lockdown has survived here at the Fritz-Karsen School in Berlin. Teacher Plocher says many of the challenges involved in digital learning remain.
The foundational problems are still there. A lot of parents don't understand technology. A lot of families don't have internet or digital technology at home. But the schools are much better prepared. So we are able to have clouds and messenger services and email that is all in accordance with data protection laws, which was not the case before.
The corona crisis has made schools realize how much still needs to be done. In most classrooms, teachers and students still use analog tools and learning materials. To change that, the German government has put aside 5 billion euros to digitalize the classroom. Money desperately needed, says co-principal Uwe Schönefeld when looking at his equipment. It is definitely the case that teachers and parents are investing their own private resources to digitalize the school. Of course, there have been initiatives by the state, but that always comes with a lot of bureaucracy, which we see now as well with the current fund. So in the end, you have to make sure you take all that you can get. Until now, only one of over 1,200 students at this school has received a tablet financed by the state. Students are aware of how slowly things are moving and want to see change. There's room for improvement in the digitalization of our school, to say the least. There's not enough equipment for all students. It was not enough to make proper homeschooling possible. But some students think that they are now better prepared in case of another lockdown. At the beginning, it was new for all of us, the system, the computers, working at home. Now I think that it would work better than the first time. But the ideal classroom that can switch effortlessly from the school to each student's room, it remains a distant goal.
Let's talk now to Professor Fernando Reimers. He's the director of the Global Education Innovation Initiative at Harvard University. Professor Reimers, thanks for joining us. You've said the current disruption to learning could cause the biggest educational setback in history. Could you expand on that for us?
Absolutely. I'm delighted to be with you. The current setback has to be set in the context of the fact that over the last 7 decades, the world experienced the most remarkable silent revolution in the history of humanity as a result of the expansion of access to school, which went from including about 1 of 2 children in school 70 years ago to including just about everyone. Now, this pandemic, through 3 mechanisms, is going to create a major setback. The first mechanism is that because schools have had to create alternative ways of delivering education in a limited time, with limited professional preparation to teachers, those mechanisms have not reached all students equally well. In addition, the kind of support that is available to students at home varies depending on the level of education of their parents and their socioeconomic level. And as a result, for the students who have not been reached effectively, and who do not have adequate support at home, they're not learning and they're not engaging in school. What that means is that some of them are going to have a very hard time continuing their studies when the pandemic is over, and some of them are going to drop out altogether. In some cases, the hardship caused by the pandemic in some families has caused those children to begin to work to help their families survive. And finally, the third mechanism is that this pandemic is creating enormous financial burdens in some states. And as a result of that, there's going to be less funding available for education. So those three mechanisms are the ones that are going to cause major setbacks in how many children are able to return to school. We're going to see many of them drop out, and we're going to see that for many children, even those who continue, there are going to be significant gaps in their knowledge that schools may or may not be able to help them recover.
So some huge challenges there. Now, you've spoken to educators all over the world. What's the most surprising thing you've heard from them?
That is correct. Over the last 6 months, I have been doing extensive research with colleagues at the OECD and at the World Bank. What has really surprised me the most are three things. Number one, the tremendous concern for education. The fact that education is seen at a time of a pandemic when life is what is at stake as a very, very serious concern. And that speaks to a major cultural shift in humanity. If you think about the last pandemic of 1918, education was not one of the top three, was not even one of the top 10 concerns. And the fact that it speaks very well about how we, as a global community, have internalized how important the development of the talent and skills of the next generation are. The second thing that has surprised me is the professionalism of many teachers who have demonstrated that to them, education is not just a job, it's a life mission. And they have worked extremely hard to create alternative ways to continue to reach their students, sometimes with the support of their local governments, state governments, sometimes in the absence of that support. The third thing that has surprised me is the remarkable creativity and innovation that has resulted from collaboration. Collaboration among teachers, within schools, among schools, collaborations among organizations of civil society and teachers. And I think that some of those innovations have been facilitated by the teachers who are connected to networks of people outside their jurisdictions. That communication, extensive communication that puts a teacher in touch with others in places far and away has created the equivalent of a Medici effect. A Medici effect is a term used to refer to what happened in Florence several decades after the Italian pandemic, when Lorenzo de' Medici convened in that city a variety of artists and intellectuals and scientists like Leonardo da Vinci, like Michelangelo, like Raphael, like Machiavelli. And out of that convergence of great minds in a small place came the Renaissance. And I think there is a potential that for some schools, this communication, this collaboration is going to really bring about some renaissance in some schools. But sadly,
nice to end on a hopeful note there. Professor Fernando Reimers, thank you so much for speaking with us.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Time now to answer one of your questions about the coronavirus. Over to our science correspondent, Derek Williams.
How do you decide which parts of the population get vaccinated first?
There's a lot of worry at both the national and international levels that when a vaccine does become available, it won't be distributed to the people who need it most on an equitable basis. But who does need it the most? Well, lawmakers are already coming up with lists of who should be at the front of the line. And with some variations, it's what health authorities around the world will hopefully carry through. Assuming that politicians are able to grasp the idea that this is a global issue that won't be solved by vaccine nationalism, which is a big if. But supplies will also be limited, initially at least. So there needs to be a framework in place to maximize benefits. The Vaccine Alliance, or Gavi, which is the international organization that plays a vital role in vaccine development and distribution all over the world, it's come up with guidelines aimed at providing the most benefit for the most people worldwide, even with limited resources. Over 150 countries have now signed up to its COVAX initiative. It recommends that the first people to get a vaccine should be those most exposed to the disease, which are the healthcare and social care workers on the pandemic front lines. Thousands of them all over the planet have died from COVID-19 already. Next in line would be older people, over 65s, along with those at high risk if they catch the disease, like people with underlying health conditions. Most countries will probably also prioritize professions that are deemed to be essential. People like caregivers in rest homes, or police officers, or those who work in key industries like food production. What's already clear is that children will be far down on the list, not only because COVID-19 is less deadly in general for them, but also because it'll take more time to produce and test vaccines that are specifically tailored to kids.